Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May. I am joined by Michael Buzzy.
Hello, everyone.
Mike Chiplock.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Shirine Hossaini.
Nice to be here.
And is it Hossaini or Hossaini?
It's Hossaini.
Hossaini. Okay, thank you very much. It's great to have you. Randy Olson.
Hello again. Happy to be back.
Kevyn Settle.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Hi. Yep. And I think Taylor Ackerman, is that you on the line?
Yeah, hello.
Okay. So we're all here, and this show actually is a continuation of a dialogue that we began a couple of weeks ago in connection with National POW MIA Recognition Day, which was on September 18th. And I see there's other people, on the switchboard, so I'll open it up shortly. But let me just get out the description of the show and where we're going today. So Mike Chiplock, Shirine, and Kevyn are all involved in this film called Fruits of Peace, which is a documentary film. And we will be talking about the incredible story behind that film today. And so we're very honored to have these filmmakers, artists, producers with us. Kevyn Settle is the producer and the director. Mike Chiplock is the executive producer, and Shirine Hossaini is the associate producer. There is a Facebook page. It's on our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. And to help with this show is a photograph. It's on the actual description for our show. And if you go to the show resources page, you can download a larger copy of this picture. And that's going to help ground the conversation today. So if you're listening to this, I would go to the website and just take a look at this picture. And the picture is of an Asian man sitting at a grave. So that's the picture that we'll be talking about. So let's just begin with the picture. And to begin, the picture, as I said, is an Asian man sitting at a grave, and the grave is of Wilmer Newlin Grubb. And Kevyn, can you tell us more about the person who is buried at this grave in the photo?
Sure. As you said, Wilmer Newlin Newk Grubb grew up in Alden, PA. It's a tiny working-class community about 30 minutes south of Philadelphia, typical Interstate 95 town. And when I say tiny, it's actually that attribute which plays very heavily into the course of action leading us to the moment of this photo, and really these families' stories becoming a documentary film. I guess throughout much of Wilmer's younger years, he was nicknamed Noogie. He was quite the sports star. He excelled in the classroom. And once you see the film, the audience sees the film, they'll associate with this. But fishing was a particular joy for him, his family, his wife, and even his sons today. However, once he got into his young adult years, Noogie, the nickname, kind of wore off, and it became Newk, which you see in that picture of on his headstone. And that was primarily due to the choice of his profession, that being a U.S. Air Force pilot. which really started with being an ROTC at Penn State University in 1955. He graduates and immediately goes into basic training for the U.S. Air Force. The flash forward 10 years later, he's duty stationed in Saigon, South Vietnam, at Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, and he's a member of the 20th TAC, which is Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron. So it was then Captain Wilmer Newk Grubb, who was piloting a jet called the RF-101, our emphasis for reconnaissance. And that jet is commonly referred to as like the Voodoo. So that's a little bit of background. There is a bit of information in this picture that actually the camera doesn't capture, but on the other side of that headstone is his wife's engraving, Evelyn Fowler Grubb, and it was in actually 1953 that they were both students at Penn State, and they eventually were married while students at Penn State.
And she, of course, Evelyn Grubb, was buried after he was in Arlington.
Yeah, Evelyn Grubb passed in 2005. And the date on the headstone is very important, too, for Newk, in terms of the story, which really played heavily in the objectives and the UFOM's own seeking out, who we'll learn more about UFOM here in a minute. But, Evelyn, just to add a little introduction to Evelyn Grubb, it was both Evelyn's and Newk's fathers that were fraternity brothers at Penn State. So they both were legacy Penn State and actually had known each other for decades, because after their fathers had graduated Penn State, they became very close friends, again, back to fishing. And you'll see and as you've seen in the film, we have some wonderful family archival 8mm color of the families enjoying an area near Ontario, which is called the Pickerel River. And you see all of that fishing footage and canoeing and what have you around the river and a cabin. So they had known each other for several decades, and they entered Penn State as friends, and they left Penn State as husband and wife. So,
Okay. So we have background on the individual who is buried at this grave, and so let's talk about the Asian man who is in the picture, and that is Pham. If you're confused, I didn't know this, that it's spelled with a D, D-U, but you pronounce it U, Pham. So, Mike, can you talk about Pham and why is he at the grave of Wilmer Grubb?
Well, it was really serendipity. When Pham came to America, I was dating his niece, and she didn't have time to take off work to show him around D.C., so I volunteered, and the only problem was we didn't speak each other's language. So I printed out attractions I was going to take him up in Vietnamese. I also got him a two-way Vietnamese dictionary book that I could find at the library at the time. And when I approached him, he presented me a picture of a captured soldier, an American, and he wanted to go to Arlington Cemetery. And I have a visitor's pass to Arlington Cemetery because I have family members buried there, so we were able to drive in proximity to the graves. And once I was parked, Pham took off, and after a few minutes he called me over, and I could see him from a distance sitting next to the grave. And I had a camera, and I just thought, okay, I'll take this picture, this moment. And he was still, and when I approached him and took more pictures of him, he was very pensive, and then kind of became agitated when he was conscious that I was around him. And he started thumbing through the dictionary, and the first word that he could find in the alphabetical order was anger. But I don't think that was the correct word. I think it wasn't a cathartic reaction, but a frustrated reaction that he couldn't communicate at the grave. Mm-hmm. And so I let him have his moment. Just let him sit, have his moment. And then I took him out for his first American hamburger. And afterwards, when I got him to my girlfriend's place, who's now my wife, he started talking a little bit about the pilot and about his brother who he was visiting, who fought for the South. And my girlfriend told me that he had spent years in a re-education camp after the fall of Saigon, and after he was released, he escaped to America by boat. And I thought I was going to leave it at that. And prior to going out and taking him about Washington, D.C., I had given him my business card, and I wrote on the back, "I'm lost. Please call this number," in case we had gotten separated. And weeks later, I get a phone call, and on the other end, there's a guy who's not speaking English, and I was sleepy, and I just politely said, "I think you have the wrong number," so I hung up. And then a few minutes later, call comes again, and there's a woman on the other end of the line, and speaking in broken English, going, "You're Mike, right? You took my father to Arlington Cemetery. Well, he wants you to come to Vietnam." And I talked to my girlfriend, I said, I just can't believe this, but your uncle just invited us to Vietnam. And she said yes, and her name is Lin Vu, and she was pivotal in initiating the context and the lay of the groundwork for production in Vietnam. And at this time, I knew I couldn't be a director because personal relationships are complex enough. And so I called on my colleague Shirine, who's covered numerous issues, and especially her specialty is human rights. And she has a skill about, instead of just asking questions, bringing out the story, and which she did with Pham through my girlfriend at the time, and with Shirine Hossaini. And that was the inertia, and that was the momentum. And Kevin was finishing up a film, and he was doing festivals, and so there was a lot of inertia in the beginning prior to the rubber hitting the road, and all four of us were just tires through this chaotic production.
Wow.
And which leads me to kind of to Shirine and her involvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Shirine, can you talk a little bit about your part of the story and what you're seeing unfold?
Yeah, I have always been very close friends with Michael, and he and Kevin have done other productions together. So when they approached me about this subject, I was originally just supposed to be consulting to help, give them some guidelines. But when Uncle Yu's brother, Uncle Mai, did not want to disclose a lot of the things he went through, I went with his niece, Lynn, Michael's wife, and had a discussion with him to make him just feel at ease, and then consequently did a few interviews with him because it was a lot of information of his tortured, sad time in the POW camps there. Mm. So that was big for me. It was big for Lynn. She had never heard that stuff before, and it was very tough. I had to more than once tell her, "Don't cry in front of him," because it was quite distressing information that he disclosed.
Mm. There's a bunch of people on the line, so I'll leave it open for anybody else to chime in or ask a question.
I'll hop in here and throw it out there, but I'm curious, before any of this had taken place, was the National League of POW MIA families on anybody's radar? Like, I'm curious, did this story unlock a whole new place for all of you, or was this something that was, on the map already?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It opened a new door. Hearing Michael tell the story about when he, and now I'm reflecting back on that time. Yeah, we had, as Shirine and Michael mentioned, I think 4 or 5 different film projects. And if I remember correctly, I was just about to push off for South Korea for another documentary film, because all this happened very quickly. And I remember Michael telling me, what he had just experienced with the UFOM. And I know Michael, at the time, we talked a lot about history, and he knows, I like history a lot. I remember Michael telling me the story, and it's almost as cloudy today for us to try to articulate what this film is about as it was for him then to say, hey, I met this guy from Vietnam, and he wanted to sit at this gravesite, and he was an anti-aircraft officer member, and he captured a pilot in the National League of Families. And it did just open a whole new door for history for me, and I knew almost nothing about the National League of Families. But we had some, knowledge of the POWMIA flag and that symbol. But I just remember saying to Michael, I'm in. Let me get back from South Korea. And that was December of 2010. And Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think right at the first week of March of 2011, we were already in Vietnam.
It just sort of snowballed. Initially, I was going, okay, this man came from Vietnam on his own to reconnect with a estranged brother that he probably fought against. And then there was a sort of mystery about who this soldier was, and all I could think about was, well, the soldier came from a family just like him, and he probably has sons or daughters or children of his own, and he had his own backstory. And when we came across the book, You Are Not Forgotten, and read the backstory of Evelyn Grubb's activism for all POWs on both sides, it was a watershed moment. It was a eureka moment, actually.
It really was. So back to the picture, because you have 2 pictures in the spread, and the fact that we have a name on the headstone that UFOM has brought us to, and then there is actually a book out there by the wife of the name on that headstone, co-written by the wife as well as by Carol Joes. We were just like, we couldn't wait to get it in our hands. I remember us talking about that, and there was just so much information in there, but there was so much information in there, but there was so little information in there in terms of what's to come with the film, what's to come with the 2 families coming together. And I think that, by and large, is one of the beautiful things about the film, and the bravery of the 2 families coming together is that there was such an exchange of information, and it just answered a lot of questions that were in Evelyn's book, and for the brothers as well, who have been for almost 50 years going without answers to their questions.
Mm-hmm. Randy, do you have any follow-up from your question?
Well, no, I'm really happy that things like this happen. I mean, it's so fascinating to know that the universe has a way of just kicking doors down when it's time for people to know about a certain kind of story, and this is one of those cases where pieces just happen to line up so that the person is coming, and then there's people there ready to go who are perfectly well suited to create a film about it, which is ridiculously unlikely. So I'm thrilled.
We're glad. It was a rolling ball of chaos that has been organized. That was presented all up on the screen for you.
So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, just reflecting back on, we're going to push off for Vietnam, and yes, Lynn was great, and we had, a little bit of terra firma, knowing Lynn and her family was there and having that translator. A lot different than if we had just, arrived into Vietnam cold with a couple of cameras. But I remember just, going through the pre-production meetings and calls and just really not knowing the lay of the land in terms of, what we were getting into from moment to moment. And it was quite the experience. Really just going from Hanoi down to the center of the country. This is on the first trip, and then ultimately down to Ho Chi Minh City. It was just really a remarkable experience. And I remember just from a storytelling perspective, I believe we saw that trip as a lot about relationship building, getting to know Pham, getting to know the country a little bit. But almost immediately as he started taking us to various places, and then, a lot of it military or war related, and then the pagodas, and of course, as seen in the film, in Tai Ben, his ancestral home village for both he and Mai, we knew we were already in production. Relationship was building as we from the word go. So,
and it reflects on the hospitality of the Vietnamese people. Initially, going back to Lynn and myself and Shirine, when we were approaching Pham, we were going on a hunch, really, because how were we going to bridge something that could possibly have been really traumatic for both families? And so we just went on a hunch to kind of, like Kevin was saying, lay of the land and to build that rapport. But we were overwhelmed with the hospitality and all the dinners and all the cheers and the beers and that they went out of their way to make us feel comfortable, and we were overwhelmed with their kindness.
Yeah, I've been to South Korea many, many times, and I find the same kind of hospitality. So that's wonderful. Shirine, did you want to add anything to this conversation?
I mean, it was a long course of events for us because it took years, and the boys went on 2 trips and countless phone calls, and like Kevin did so much research. And I don't think it can translate properly just how much went into it. And on top of that, the actual caring and compassion that it has to bring out in anybody. And it was just such an emotional story, and really fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's like the gesture of Pham, going to Newk's grave has so much, and I'm using a phrase of Jane Addams. It's not my phrase. Jane Addams, who was the first United States woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, refers to, and we refer to this phrase a lot on this show, quote, moral energy. There's so much in that, and it's sort of, exploding. It's still continuing to explode, and to sort of grasp that moment. And this is why we're doing this show. And I've been talking to Kevin, since August. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the story. But so much fragmentation is the result, and we're trying to put the pieces back together, and that takes a very long time and so much research. And we on this group of people on this call in Michigan, engage in this kind of painstaking multi-year research to piece together a different, very emotional story, but that I think brought us together. But yeah, and I think the youngest person on the line is Michael Buzzy. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, so I find that people who haven't engaged in a kind of like big storytelling don't appreciate how long and how much research, painstaking research in archives, and Shirine, just the painful trust building to get people to talk, right? So much labor involved. And I just want to ask you, Michael, you've been working on this story for a little while now, and if you could, give a comment on like how you're seeing the magnitude of the story and how long it takes to transmit.
Yeah, and I think that magnification and resonance is definitely something that has continued to, it comes in waves, I feel like. So it was, my entry into this whole cause was through Hope reaching out to me to be involved with Central Michigan University's own first POW MIA Recognition Day, which then she gives me a bunch of information pertaining to, a Vietnamese man who fought for the North ends up coming to the United States, and then there's this individual named Newk Grubb who was shot down, and then there's his wife, Evelyn Grubb, who went through this whole process of organizing fellow women who had no contact with their sons or their husband overseas, and complete fragmentation. So it's like the initial sort of tsunami that hits you, and then, okay, you're in the water and you're trying to wade your way through this. And I feel it is truly, and I think this was a point I had reiterated on the previous show, that this story and these individuals have truly embedded themselves into the fiber of my being, like the 4 Grubb boys and Evelyn's journey and Pham's own personal journey with his family, and how war and peace and, how do we recognize the past, and all of these extremely important themes of life that pertain to this story has truly touched me in an immense way. And I think as I have continued on, the story is one that's even come to embed itself more into me. 2 weeks this coming Saturday, I lost my own father tragically at the age of 56 due to a heart attack. And last weekend I had watched the documentary Fruits of Peace. And so, having only been 7 days since I had lost my own father, watching the 4 Grubb boys discuss the loss of their own dad due to tragic circumstances, and to see that raw emotion, and I think it allowed me to relate to them in this immediacy and this intimate way that their story was so human, and regardless of the international implications in the political sense, it is truly one that has already reached into me so much. But then having gone through my own personal life event recently, that watching it, there was many moments when the Grubb boys would cry for their dad, and then I was crying with them. Like that's a pain I understand. And truly, it hit me in a whole another way that I never expected. So I am most fortunate to have been able to have worked on this process. I am so humbled and grateful to know this story, and it is truly one I hope to transmit to other individuals, that this is something that needs to permeate deeper into wider cultural recognition, because it is just so profound and incredible. And I thank the three of you for having brought this to life, because this was something the world needs to know, and I am most grateful.
Thank you for sharing. That's really wonderful to hear from you. And I personally cry every single time I watch those boys cry for their father. it never changes. It's so emotional.
I'd like to ask a question on go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you, Michael, for your comments, and I'm sorry for your recent loss. Thank you.
Due to the gravity of the situation and, the various different levels of, people would have a lot of different reasons for wanting to shield themselves or shield information. I'm curious, Hope brought up the point that this kind of information is kind of difficult to get people to talk about. And I'm curious to know whether there was a pattern of having to kind of twist people's arms in order to get their sides of the story out, or whether there was this general air of, wow, yeah, let's definitely get on board and share our side of it. And I suspect Shirine is the mastermind here, but I'm curious for just toss that up and see what happens.
Well, as you see in the film, we had a lot of interview sessions in various locations, rooftop, patios, UFAM's studio, family members' studio, hotel room in Quang Binh. UFAM, from the word go, was very forthcoming and very open. I can't recall he avoiding any question directly or not or not being forthright. I believe that UFAM is a very emotional person, and he's a very caring person. He's very well-read in world history as well as American history. And I think a lot of his actions are rooted in Confucianism, which, he talks a lot about. And in the film, there are several moments what the editor, Bob Canner, and myself would call duisms. And it was really when he just landed on these statements such as, if we're always revenging, then when do the bad things end? I mean, that's a very powerful statement. Other ones such as, we only talk about the history, although it's painful now, so our children don't repeat our mistakes. That's a powerful statement. He's a very philosophical person. I never for once felt that he or any of C4 held anything back. And they knew they were mic'd all the time too, or even in the sides, they understand after a while, especially when we're in the field in Quang Binh with UFAM's unit members, Mr. Me, Mr. Pho, Mr. Big Jong, we had the opportunities where we could hear mics and get the translation, or we could hear the audio, get the translations, and then, they were having a little side conversations unknowing that they were mic'd, and we never heard anything on what's called a hot mic that made us doubt their effort or their gestures. The same with the Grubb family. I think they were very forthcoming, and it wasn't easy because, as we say, they had the war ended. Operation Homecoming was a little bit of a bookend, and then the end for really those prisoners that died in captivity came home in early '74. And that's when, in April '74, Newk was buried, and I think that was a closest chapter for the family, and went to Florida to even further cement the closure. It's only, I believe, Evelyn started to write the book about the time that she may have thought she was going to get sick with cancer. The book sat for a number of years until Carol Jones was able to finish it. So there was a closure there that they could have just, again, back to the specific question, a closure there that I think the Grubb family could have just maintained, yet they were very brave and receptive to us in working with us, obviously, in the interviews, and then, of course, all four of them going to Vietnam. I mean, as Jeff Grubb says, it's history repeating itself. Here's the man, meaning the men, going off to Vietnam while the wives stay home. Another powerful statement, and there's some really hard truth in that. Here's the man going off to Vietnam while the wives stay home. It's history repeating itself. So
but now there was another brother, my Pham. His approach was a little deflective because he was on the losing end of this war, and he experienced some personal trauma that is similar to getting the translation or the hot mic. We knew that in some of the answers that there was some deflection, that we had to delve a little more, take a different approach with my Pham that Shirine can expand upon, because that was a different side. And these are brothers that have completely different perspective. And he didn't, when we said, hey, we can take you to Vietnam, he was hesitant. He was thinking about it. He teased about it a little bit. But then, he's advanced in age, and I think probably that was difficult for him. Shirine, do you want to expand on that?
Well, Uncle Mai's situation, having fought for the Americans, was very different from Uncle Yu. And so there's another story actually at play here. And Uncle Mai never, ever spoke to his family about what he went through. When he spoke to me, that was the first time he had ever voiced that stuff, and it was really shocking for Lynn, his niece, to hear. And many times asking him questions, he tried to skirt around it, but I just kept asking him in a different manner, and then he would be like, okay, since you're just so insistent, I'll answer you, because he knew what he was doing, and I think that's second nature for people that have like post-traumatic stress syndrome, and you tend to deflect, you tend to answer the question without answering the real meat of the question. So for me, I have been through PTSD treatment myself, so I was able to recognize what Uncle Mai was doing and able to gently steer him. And then also had to, of course, discuss a little bit of my own background so that I would be able to gain his trust, and not just trust. He had to know that I could see things for what they really were. So it was very touching, very difficult.
Yeah, it was a lot of silence.
Vulnerability.
It was
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
It was what wasn't said with my Pham. That was just as impactful than what was said compared to you, Pham.
Yeah, it sounds like in his case there was a whole bunch of personal things that are hard to even package into the story, because like his story alone has an entire 2 hours of a film in order to represent his personal experience. And so it's like, okay, what parts of that are we going to include for this narrative?
Yeah, there's a lot in what we got from my Pham that didn't make it into the film. There's the entirety of his prisoner of war experience, which we do, speak about with Al Brunstrom, obviously. But you're right. There's a lot left on the floor in the editing. But
so, I just want to, try to distill some of the things that we're saying here, and then, move on. We've mentioned the Grubb family, but when we first started talking about this picture, which is taken at Arlington, and so, Mike, you took that picture and you provided Pham with the Vietnamese English dictionary. And when we started talking about that one picture, Kevyn pointed out that that picture doesn't say everything, and that behind the headstone is Evelyn's name, so Newk's wife. And so there's always these other aspects of the story that need time to come into consciousness. But I also see this, as we're talking about this story, because it involves family and people and connection, you can't really understand a person without understanding to whom they are connected. So in the case of Newk and Evelyn, you can't understand Newk without Evie, and you can't understand Evie without Newk, and you can't understand Pham without my Pham and that relationship. And so that's part of the complexity and getting the story out. We did mention, the Grubb family going to Vietnam, which is this other. I mean, you have several stories in the film. One between you and my Pham, and then the Grubb family going to Vietnam. And I just want, Kevyn, for you to talk about, how does that happen? Because as we've said in the beginning, Pham is at the grave and he's not in touch with the family. And I also think we should add in that, and Mike, when you're talking about he's angry, or that's not the word, is it a fair assumption that kind of frustration that he's feeling is that he was expecting Newk to be alive, and then learned on this trip that he had in fact died? Is that an accurate interpretation, or can you speak to that, Mike?
Not through hindsight with the research, but in the moment, I think it was a kind of a cathartic reaction that only he could answer. It may be in the perspective that the dates when he was captured to when he actually died, and Evelyn being an activist for so many years, thinking that her husband was alive. So it could be a combination of things.
But I mean, he does, when he comes to the United States, he doesn't know that Newk has died, does he?
No. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I think he tried to go to Pennsylvania, and he just didn't know the countryside, America. But I think his own research, I think he came to that knowledge and then wanted to go to Arlington Cemetery.
So, Kevyn, can you speak about that?
Yeah, so really, duty to remember here, as we said, how are these subjects or characters' journeys of reconciliation, how are they unique yet maybe similar at the same time? I think for Pham, he came to America to reconcile a little bit with his brother, right? And that drive to remember his brother, my Pham, is very strong. All right, he hadn't seen him in 26 years almost. And Pham, we all have Pham in our family or our extended family. He's the guy that's running around, planning events, doing the get-togethers, the first one to call when there's a need or a problem. He's a little bit of a social person like that, and we all have that person. So we could, associate some of these attributes. But he's always, as well, worked hard to repair maybe the damage done to the family. The family had endured significant hardship, not only during the French War, but right at the end when the French capitulated, they were divided. As we, two brothers stayed north, two brothers went south. So there was a drive there when he came to America to reconcile. He had already, years before pleaded with my Pham to come back to Vietnam because their mother was dying. And he asked my Pham to come back and please visit Mom before she dies. And he couldn't. My Pham couldn't come back because he had endured so much. And I really think when Pham came here to the United States, as he said, he had two objectives. One was, hey, my Pham, come back to our ancestral village, come back to our home, visit Vietnam before you die, have some reconciliation, have some peace. And as a second objective was to meet Newk Grubb. And in fact, he failed at both objectives. He really did. And he taking action is what really led us, to the film. But in fact, Pham did, as Michael said, went up to Philadelphia. They have a distant relative that's up there. And they did search Alden, PA. When I said it was a tiny town, it was a tiny town. It still is. And they were knocking door to door. And someone finally told Pham, oh, yeah, I know that family name. And this is, paraphrasing here. But he died in Vietnam, and his family moved to Florida. They have 4 sons, and one was born when he died, after he had died. And so that's when really Pham, I think, took action to find more information, that being wanting to visit Arlington, wanting to visit the Vietnam Wall. In fact, when Pham called back to Vietnam to speak to Colonel Tway, who is their commander at the time, who's since passed, Tway tells Pham, hey, if Grubb died in Vietnam, his name must be on their wall, meaning the Vietnam Memorial Wall. And so that's really how he took action, and really the connective tissue to, Lynn bringing Michael in because he wanted to see Arlington and he wanted to find out more information. But there's another, remembrance, why he wants to reach out to Grubb. So we must answer that question. Why Grubb, right? So when you uncover a little bit of Pham's military unit's history, right? They have a book, they have a directory, a printed matter. It gives the history, and on the very first page, it has that other picture of Newk Grubb with the nurse tending to his knee. And the reason it's there on the first page is because that was C4's first victory, their first shoot down. They had only been in active duty for a month. Their first shoot down was Newk Grubb, and they captured him. Mm-hmm. So Newk Grubb has always been number one for them. So I know that when Pham was coming to America, he wanted to have a beer with Newk Grubb and talk about war stories. What he didn't know was that Newk Grubb was dead already. And in fact, we have to put ourselves in his shoes. 70s, Vietnamese. There's very little at the time in 2009, 2010. There's no Facebook in Vietnam then. His computing skills and internet skills are somewhat, limited. So he came and was unsuccessful on both his bids. A bid to get his brother to come home, who had already denied him once, and a bid to meet Newk Grubb.
Mm-hmm. And so, just again distill a big story, he comes to the United States for these 2 reconciliatory journeys, one with his brother and one just to meet Newk, who was legend in his unit of C4. And he fails. His brother does not go back to Vietnam, and Newk is dead. But he continues, and he goes to the grave, and then he ends up communicating with the family. And I think that this just shows his fortitude and like the emotion behind this persistence and this fortitude, and that's part of the power of this story and the moment of, because that him at the grave is part of this longer journey, and he doesn't stop. So he does reach out to the Grubb family, and Kevin, can you talk about how does that happen? So he goes to the grave, he realizes Newk is dead, and then what?
Pham writes a letter to the Grubb family, and I brought it down to Florida to meet them. That's
very quick.
In fact,
it's
a huh?
That's very quick.
That.
I mean, how does he know that there is a Grubb family?
Well, he wrote the letter after our first visit, and we brought the book. So you communicated we had to.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, and there was other facts too. So when he went to the Vietnam Wall, there's the Vietnam Memorial Wall. There's a service center there. And not only there, but also on the internet, eventually there's just misinformation. And this kind of chasing and correcting the record is part of the film as well, as C4 is wondering why, the local newspaper doesn't give them credit for their accomplishment that, as you say, legendary, first victory was Newk Grubb. And so he writes a letter, but it just came out of nowhere. In fact, there's a funny aside. He had egged both Michael and myself to ride a scooter with him the entire first trip, and I myself being 6'4", Pham's roughly 5'4", and in the 70s, and we had both seen the traffic in Hanoi, and I politely declined. I wasn't going to get back to the scooter. But on my last day, and I think Michael and Lynn were doing something with Lynn's family, Pham shows up, and he has 2 helmets. He has an extra helmet in his hand. And so I caved. And so for half a day, he rode me around on his scooter. And we had pulled over once or twice to get a refreshing drink, and we pulled over for a coffee one time. And he had his little satchel, and he pulled out a pen and pad, and he just began writing a letter. And I didn't have the video camera because I'm about to ride I'm certain to have a, if not painful, somewhat of a eventful tumble off the scooter. So I just thought I'd leave the camera in the hotel room. And I did have a still camera, but I, looked over his shoulder because he was pretty dutiful. He was pretty, intent on writing this. And I looked at the top of the paper, and it said, "Dear all relatives of Grubb." And I started snapping pictures. And so to bridge to, meeting the Grubb family for the first time, there's Carol Joes with the book. I had written, or actually we had written a letter to some veterans, former members of another Air Force unit, saying that, we had some information, because it took us a couple of years to make sure what we had is what was right. We wanted to, use the word vet, but we also wanted to verify and confirm the information before reaching out. And they bridged us to Carol Joes, and Carol hosted myself coming down to Florida to meet both Roy Grubb and Stephen Grubb for the first time, and I shared with them what we had, and I shared with them pictures that we had taken, and Michael and I had edited a series of short little video vignettes that talked about the various topics, a lot about their family, not the Grubb family, but the Pham family. And then we showed them the information we had, and I asked, we're making a film. We've been working on this. It's an important film for the Pham family and for you, Pham, and their journeys intersect with your journey, your father's human experience. If you want to be part of this, we'd love to have you, and we'll make that happen. Or you can. Here's Pham's letter. Here's his phone number. It's on the letter. Here's his email. It's on the letter. You don't have to be part of the film. You can make your connection with Pham directly and get answers to questions that you have. I'm sure he'll be more than willing to meet with you, either digitally or personally. But we'd love to have you as part of the film. We think it'd be a powerful lesson and story here. The next night we were having a hamburger, and I was flying out early the third morning, and we were having a hamburger and a beer at a local place. And Roy Grubb said, of course, Roy, who had never met his father, was born 6 months after his father was shut down, said, we've spoken with Jeff and Roland, the two oldest brothers that weren't in Florida at the time, and they said, we're all in. We're in. And that's what led us to that phase of Fruits of Peace.
Wow. A brief comment, because I'm rather overwhelmed at the collage of heroes in this story. There's so many names here that are worth knowing now that I've gotten a brief picture here, and I'm really just blown away at the idea that this pocket of history has this seriously non-trivial number of people engaged in these tremendous journeys of personal triumph, where it's like there was this idea of, okay, Pham comes to the United States and fails, and I find myself so confused by that, because all that's emerged from his journey to the United States has been my definition of victory, but it's like he's dealing with this inner situation where he wants to come see his brother, and he wants to come potentially, meet Newk Grubb and sit down and talk with him, but he's also there for himself, and in that part he's just overwhelmingly successful. And so there's that same set of victory, triumph is present in the side of Evelyn Grubb, which we didn't really get around to talking too much about this time, but over and over again I'm just blown away by okay, the pieces have fallen together, let's dig into this deeper, and it unfolds into something that's really heroic and incredible. So I really appreciate all of you being here to share this story. Bringing it all to life is truly meaningful for me.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to?
It's been our honor.
And anybody else? Go ahead, Taylor.
I do have one question. I'm wondering, I know the film was so meaningful to us, and I think we've all, everyone sort of communicated that watching. Have you heard any feedback from other former POWs who've watched the films, or other families who've been affected by the loss of a loved one due to the Vietnam War or another war? And if so, maybe is there a story that stands out, or a story of someone who maybe didn't end up in the film but who was deeply impacted by this story, and the power of the storytelling and the power of remembering these sort of hidden or these sort of honors history here?
So, Yeah, great questions. Let me try to unpack that a little bit. We did have a fantastic screening down in North Carolina in a theater full of veterans, if you were to watch the video of the Q&A after, I think you would just be blown away by how overcome most of them were with emotion. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. It's a tough subject to tackle, not only just the Vietnam War, but the POW/MIA subject, understanding that there's still a great number, almost 1,600 still MIAs from the Vietnam War, with families that don't have closure. And, for the POWs themselves, obviously Al Brunstrom is in the film. Al was Newk's squadron mate and his wingman, as portrayed in the film. At the time Newk was shot down, Al himself got shot down and became a POW just 2 months after. He was a POW for 6 years and 10 months. There are several other POWs that I've spoken with and have seen the film, including some of both Newk and Evelyn's friends from Penn State and from their high school in Alden, PA, have seen the film. The response has been great. I think, when we talk about a Vietnam documentary, I think Vietnam is the backdrop here. This is a documentary about families, about the human experience, which is very vast. Vietnam does do a lot of the mile marking for us here, or mile posting, but when you get into the fabric here, it's about two families. It's just the Vietnam was the common event, as well as January 26, 1966. I have a very, I grew up in Vietnam. For me, was Rambo and Missing in Action with Chuck Norris. It was so different. It was so different than everything I had read and people had spoken to who were World War II veterans. When I got involved in this project, understanding that there's so much tumultuous views about Vietnam. Was it right, wrong, the war at home? We wanted to not cover, and we wanted to cover none of that. We wanted this film to be different, even down to the soundtrack. Quite often you turn on anything that has to do with Vietnam era, where it's the war, politics, and you hear the same music, the same soundtrack. Our music selection was purposeful in avoiding, I don't want to say cliches, but all that stuff, and I think everyone has appreciated it. It's a different take on an old subject. It's a new, fresh take on an old subject.
And I made this point last time. In a way, it's new, but it's not. I mean, yes, it's a new treatment of the Vietnam War, but this telling the story of war through the effect on families. As I've mentioned, this is really the work. The person who pioneers this narrative about war is Bertha von Suttner, who dies in 1914, and she's the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Actually, tomorrow, or not tomorrow, on the 10th, they should announce this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner. That's the day on which Nobel died, and so the Peace Prize is always announced on October 10th. But anyway, this is so powerful to understand, like you're saying, Kevin, that it's not Rambo, it's not Missing in Action. It's this effect on families, and that's what's different about the film, but it has this lineage to the peace movement, because this was this framework on war is galvanized very much the pre-World War I international peace movement, which Bertha von Suttner was leading. And all of us in Michigan, are sort of have been working on that story for at least the past 7 years, and quite literally that took us to the POW flag. So I leave it open if anybody else wants to comment on the conversation. Nobody? Pause for thought. Okay, then. So we've been going for about an hour. It may be a natural place to end this dialogue. So we'll converge on closing out today's conversation. We did mention this other photo and other loose ends, including the story of Evelyn Grubb, which is not so much discussed on this show. So perhaps we can come back and continue talking. But let me just leave it open for anybody to, and we'll start with Michael Buzzy and just go around and end at Taylor. See if anybody wants to just end the show with some food for thought or other reflective remarks.
Thank you, Hope.
Mm-hmm.
I have truly been so honored to have been able to have been a part of this experience and getting to hear from the three of you who brought this, in my opinion, absolutely incredible film to light. I'm, like I had stated before, I'm most fortunate to know this story, and it was a really awesome experience today getting to sit here and listen to, the process of how it went, and sort of the B-roll stuff, Pham having his first hamburger and his emotions and all when you first saw him at Arlington Cemetery. That was very insightful, and it truly just further adds on to my love and appreciation of an already amazing film. So I thank the three of you so much. I'm most fortunate to know this.
Yeah, my life changed over a hamburger, so that's all I can really say. I'm quite dumbfounded, and so here we are, over a hamburger.
Yeah.
But it's been a wonderful growth process, and if I didn't have the opportunity, we were collaborated, and everybody took over on the steering wheel and steered the story. And Kevin's an excellent researcher. Shirine has great insight. I helped kind of sort, and Lynn was a good coordinator and was a shoulder to cry on when things got really chaotic at times with production.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Shirine?
Yes. I'm so happy to share the journey that we experienced with y'all, and to be able to show you that there's so many layers, and to be able to peel a few of those back, it feels good, because I like to let people know what it takes to really dig into something like this. And I appreciate, Michael and his family opening up, and the Grubb family. They were wonderful. And Kevin with his excellent research and directing. It's been really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. And Randy?
Well, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, but it's maybe time for a couple more hamburgers. I'm just the big takeaway for me personally is that, as much as I've studied history, Vietnam was always kind of, and I think I'm stealing this from the film, but it's like the boogeyman where it was the war. It was the war that the United States was a part of that was never humanized for me, and so I can safely say that that's not true anymore. And so, speaking individually, that's kind of, it's a significant thing for me to be able to say that about such a, it's a long period of history to kind of have a better frame of reference for. So, again, gratitude is the only road for me.
Thanks. Kevyn?
I do appreciate the opportunity, allowing the three of us to come here and talk about our film. It really is a great opportunity, and there are a lot of themes and a lot of different subjects packed into this film. But I think, having heard, the response, I know we have some advocates for some of those themes, and that's what we hope to do as documentarians is, bring a cause or a subject to light so people who might not ordinarily look at that topic or subject can learn from it, can take it and think more deeply about it, and quite possibly share it with other people. And that's all we ask. So, we're glad that you guys have received the film so well, and that you have, again, welcomed us here onto your show. So thank you.
Thank you. Taylor?
Yeah, I just want to say it was a great film, and thank you for coming onto the show and telling us the story about how it came to be, and sort of bringing to light the power of reconciliation on a personal level for each of the family members, and how it really was an act of labor on many different people to bring about this sort of this story and this moment of reconciliation and memory. So I thought it was a great film, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and I'll just
Thank you.
Yeah. Go back to the hamburger comment yet again, and so yeah, my life changed over a hamburger. Here, that remark, Mike. So again, to connect it with Bertha, her life changed over a cup of tea, and I really want to focus on this kind of like the ordinariness, number one, and as Taylor is saying, this is like a personal journey. When we talk about the duty to remember, we tend to focus on the duties of the state, that the state has a duty to put up archives, that the state has a duty to put up monuments, the state has a duty to make reparations and so forth. And this is a story about an individual and reaching out to another individual through his heart and conscience. It is an ordinary story, but also an extraordinary story in the way that when Bertha was having a cup of tea after she received her check for writing a book that has yet to be translated into English, but we're working on doing that, she took her husband to France, and they were just sitting around with other artists, writers, and she learned about the organized Peace Through Law movement. And she says, I was shocked and electrified by it. She very much, similar energy to making Fruits of Peace, I think, that she had to do something to contribute to this movement. So she writes this book, Die Waffe Nieder, which became a worldwide bestseller, catapulted into to the front of the peace movement, and she wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905. So this is a story about individual journeys, not the act of state, and the importance of individuals acting in this way through their memory duties. And it's a story about ordinary things and extraordinary things, extraordinary moments in ordinary moments. So please learn more. There's some resources at our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com, including a link to the Facebook page of Fruits of Peace. And we thank you all so much, and hopefully we can come back and continue talking about the story in due course. So have a good evening, and this is the awkward goodbye that I mentioned earlier. So with
Thank
that,
you.
have a great evening.
It's been an honor.
Yep. Likewise. Bye-bye.